She was the only woman who stayed 30 days in his mine and discovered Gold Tycoon's darkest secret. The autumn wind of 1887 carried the scent of snow down from the high peaks of the Colorado Rockies as Margaret O'Sullivan emerged from the depths of the Redemption mine, her weathered hands clutching a small leather pouch that contained evidence powerful enough to destroy the most feared man in 3 counties. 30 days and 30 nights she had spent in those accursed tunnels, and the woman who climbed toward the surface bore little resemblance to the desperate widow who had first descended into Jeremiah Blackwood's underground kingdom. Her once pristine work dress hung in tatters, stained with the red clay and black coal dust that marked every surface in the mine's deepest reaches. The auburn hair that had once been her pride was now matted beneath a miner's cap that had belonged to God knows how many men before her. Men who had tried and failed to complete the 30-day challenge that she had somehow survived. But it was her eyes that told the real story of those weeks underground. The soft green eyes that her late husband Patrick had compared to spring meadows were now hard as emeralds, filled with a knowledge that no woman should possess and a determination forged in the fires of absolute terror. Behind her, the mine shaft yawned like the mouth of some primordial beast, exhaling the fetid breath of secrets buried deep in the Colorado earth. Margaret turned back once, her heart hammering against her ribs as she remembered what lay hidden in those twisted tunnels. Chambers that served no mining purpose, galleries filled with the portraits of the dead, and tunnels that echoed with the whispered confessions of a madman. Each step away from that accursed hole felt like a small victory against forces that had tried to claim her soul. The setting sun painted the rocky landscape in shades of blood and gold, and for the first time in a month, Margaret felt the kiss of clean mountain air on her face. In her leather pouch lay evidence that could bring down Jeremiah Blackwood, if she lived long enough to present it, but she knew that her real battle was just beginning. Blackwood's influence extended far beyond his mining empire, reaching into every level of territorial government and local law enforcement. She would need more than evidence to bring him to justice. She would need the kind of courage that could only be forged in the deepest darkness imaginable. As she made her way up the rocky path toward the mining camp, Margaret reflected on the woman she had been 30 days ago, desperate, frightened, willing to accept any offer that might save her from destitution. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone from a different life entirely. The sounds of the mining camp drifted toward her on the evening breeze. The rhythmic clang of hammers on metal, the creak of rope and pulley systems, the rough laughter of men who had spent their day wresting gold from the unforgiving earth. Normal sounds from a normal world that seemed impossibly distant after what she had experienced in the depths below. Margaret paused at the crest of the hill, looking down at the collection of wooden buildings that comprised Goldstone Gulch. Somewhere in that cluster of saloons, boarding houses and supply stores, people were going about their ordinary lives, completely unaware that they lived under the shadow of a monster whose appetite for human suffering seemed to know no bounds. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of exposing Jeremiah Blackwood's crimes. Tonight, she would allow herself one last moment of quiet before the storm that was sure to follow. Because she knew, with the certainty of someone who had looked into the heart of true evil, that Jeremiah Blackwood would not surrender his dark kingdom without a fight that would test every ounce of strength she had gained during her 30 days in hell. 4 weeks earlier, the foreclosure notice trembled in Margaret O'Sullivan's weathered hands as she sat at her kitchen table, watching the first light of dawn creep through windows that would soon belong to the Territorial Bank of Colorado Springs. The document might as well have been her death warrant. At 45, with no family nearby and precious few skills that could earn her a living wage in the harsh Colorado territory, losing her home meant facing a future as bleak as the wind-swept plains beyond her door. Her husband Patrick had been dead 6 months now, claimed by the lung fever that stalked the mining camps like some biblical plague. What he'd left behind Debts, empty promises, and a homestead mortgage to the hilt wasn't enough to cover even the interest on the loans he'd taken to finance his endless pursuit of the mother lode that always seemed to lie just beyond the next shaft, the next claim, the next desperate gamble. Margaret had tried everything in the months since Patrick's death. She'd sold his mining equipment to pay for the funeral, pawned her mother's china to buy food through the winter, and finally sacrificed her wedding ring, the simple gold band that had been her most precious possession, to make a payment on the mortgage. None of it had been enough to satisfy the voracious appetite of the territorial banking system. The sound of her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson's morning routine drifted through the thin walls of the adjacent homestead, the clatter of pots and pans, the scrape of a chair across wooden floors, the gentle humming of a woman who still had reason to face each day with hope. Margaret envied her that simple luxury, the ability to plan for tomorrow without the constant fear of where she would lay her head when darkness fell. Her 3 children, Sean, 24, Michael, 22, and little Bridget, now 19, had all headed east to Denver and beyond, chasing opportunities that didn't exist in the dying mining towns of the Colorado Territory. Sean wrote occasionally from his job with the railroad. Michael had found work in a Denver bank, and Bridget had married a store clerk and moved to Boston. They all had their own lives now, their own struggles, and Margaret couldn't bring herself to burden them with her financial troubles. A knock at her front door interrupted her dark meditation. Through the window, she could see a figure that commanded attention even in silhouette. Tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a coat that probably cost more than most miners earned in a month. The sight made her stomach clench with recognition and dread. Jeremiah Blackwood. Everyone in Goldstone Gulch knew the stories about Jeremiah Blackwood. He'd arrived in the territory 15 years ago with nothing but the clothes on his back and an ambition that seemed to burn like a forge fire in his chest. Now he owned more mines than most men could count, employed half the territory's workforce, and lived in a mansion that would have been impressive even in the refined cities of the eastern seaboard. He was also, according to the whispered conversations that took place in the town's saloons and general stores, completely mad. The stories varied in their details, but they all carried the same underlying current of unease. Workers who disappeared without explanation from his more remote mining operations. Women who came to work for his household staff and were never seen again. Strange lights and sounds emanating from the abandoned shafts on his property during the dark hours before dawn. Most people dismissed these tales as frontier superstition, the kind of ghost stories that miners told each other during long winter nights. But there was something about Jeremiah Blackwood himself, the way his eyes seemed to look through people rather than at them, the too-perfect courtesy that felt like a mask covering something darker, that made even his defenders uncomfortable in his presence. The knock came again, firm and measured, with the confidence of a man who expected his summons to be answered immediately. Margaret smoothed her worn dress, one of only 2 decent garments she still owned, and opened the door with the resigned air of someone who had no choice but to face whatever fate had delivered to her threshold. Jeremiah Blackwood was undeniably a handsome man, she had to admit. His dark hair was touched with distinguished silver at the temples, and his blue eyes held an intensity that made her take an involuntary step backward. He removed his hat with practiced courtesy, revealing a face that belonged in the daguerreotypes of distinguished gentlemen that adorned the walls of the territory's finer establishments. "Mrs. O'Sullivan," he said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of Boston or New York, though local gossip suggested he'd been born somewhere in the rougher regions of Missouri or Arkansas. "I understand you find yourself in some financial difficulty." Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. The entire territory seemed to know about her circumstances, a humiliation that cut deeper than the poverty itself. "Mr. Blackwood, I'm not sure that's really any concern of yours." "On the contrary," he said, stepping into her modest parlor without waiting for an invitation, his penetrating gaze taking in every detail of her reduced circumstances. I make it my business to know when capable people in my territory are facing hardship, especially when those people might be of considerable service to me in return for generous compensation. She closed the door behind him, noting how he'd referred to the entire region as his territory, as if he owned every acre from the Continental Divide to the Eastern Plains. The presumption should have annoyed her, but Margaret had to admit there was some truth to the claim. Jeremiah Blackwood's influence extended into every aspect of life in the Colorado mining districts. "I'm not sure what you mean, sir. I have no particular skills that would be of value to someone in your position." Jeremiah moved to her fireplace, studying the daguerreotype of her wedding day that sat on the mantel like a monument to happier times. In the photograph, she and Patrick looked impossibly young and optimistic, their faces bright with the kind of hope that only comes to people who believe their love can overcome any obstacle. "You worked the claims with your husband, didn't you?" Jeremiah asked, his finger tracing the edge of the photograph's frame with disturbing familiarity. "Real mining work, not just the cooking and washing that most women do for the men." "I did." Margaret lifted her chin with a pride that poverty hadn't yet managed to steal. Patrick had been a good man and a loving husband, but he'd never possessed much natural instinct for the technical aspects of mining. She'd been the one to read the rock formations, to understand where the promising veins might lead, to know when to dig deeper and when to abandon a played-out claim. "And you're not afraid of hard work, physical labor, dangerous conditions that would intimidate most people?" "I've never been afraid of honest work, Mr. Blackwood. Patrick and I built everything we had through our own sweat and determination." Jeremiah turned from the mantel, and something in his expression made her pulse quicken, though whether from fear or some other emotion she couldn't immediately identify. "I have a proposition for you, Mrs. O'Sullivan. A business arrangement that could solve all your financial troubles in a single stroke." Despite every instinct warning her to be cautious, Margaret felt a flutter of desperate hope. "What sort of arrangement?" "I own a mine about 5 miles up Deadman's Creek. The Redemption Mine, I call it, named for its ability to redeem the fortunes of those brave enough to work its depths. It's challenging work, I won't lie to you. The shaft goes deeper than most men are comfortable with, and the conditions can be quite harsh. But I need someone to work it for 30 consecutive days. No breaks, no days off, no excuses for abandoning the task before completion." Margaret frowned. In all her years around mining operations, she'd never heard of such an arrangement. "That's highly unusual, Mr. Blackwood. Most mines operate on daily shifts, with workers rotating in and out. What you're describing sounds more like..." "Like what, Mrs. O'Sullivan?" "Like a test. Or a punishment." Jeremiah's smile didn't reach his eyes, and Margaret noticed for the first time that his teeth were very white and very sharp. "Perhaps it is, in a way. You see, I've had considerable difficulty finding workers willing to tackle the Redemption Mine's deeper shafts. The work is intimate, you might say. Requires a certain temperament that most men seem to lack." The way he said the word intimate made Margaret's skin crawl, though she couldn't exactly say why. "How many workers have you tried this arrangement with?" 17 men in the past 2 years, he answered readily, as if he'd been expecting the question. "The longest any of them lasted was 6 days. Most don't make it past the first week before they lose their nerve." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather seeping through her poorly insulated walls. "What happened to them? Why did they leave?" Jeremiah's expression became thoughtful, almost philosophical. "They lost their nerve, I'm afraid. Something about the mine's deepest levels tends to unsettle people. The way sound carries in those tunnels, the peculiar acoustics, the sense of being watched by unseen eyes. Some men claimed to hear voices calling to them from the darkness. Others reported seeing things that couldn't possibly be there." He paused, watching Margaret's face carefully for her reaction. "Of course, I suspect most of these reports were simply the products of overactive imaginations and insufficient mental fortitude. the kind of weakness that prevents men from achieving true greatness in any endeavor. And you think a woman would be less susceptible to these psychological pressures? I think the right woman might possess qualities that men typically lack. Patience, for instance. Intuition. The ability to work in close, intimate spaces without losing composure. Again, that word, intimate, spoken with an emphasis that made Margaret feel like insects were crawling beneath her skin. A woman who understands the value of dedication, of seeing a commitment through to its conclusion, regardless of the personal cost. Margaret studied his face, trying to read the intentions behind those penetrating blue eyes. Something about this entire conversation felt wrong, but she couldn't put her finger on exactly what was bothering her. What would the compensation be for this work? $500. The figure hit Margaret like a physical blow. $500 was more money than she'd seen in one place during her entire marriage. It was enough to pay off Patrick's debts, keep her home, and live comfortably for 2 years or more. It was also far more than any legitimate mining job should pay, which meant, "That's a very generous offer, Mr. Blackwood. Perhaps too generous. What aren't you telling me about this position?" His smile widened, and for just a moment she glimpsed something predatory lurking beneath his genteel exterior. "You're a perceptive woman, Mrs. O'Sullivan. I find that quality refreshing. The truth is, the redemption mine has developed something of a reputation among the local workers. Superstitious nonsense mostly, but it affects their willingness to tackle the deeper shafts." "What kind of reputation?" "Some people claim it's haunted, that it drives men mad, that anyone who spends too much time in its depths begins to lose their grip on reality." Jeremiah shrugged dismissively. "Foolishness, of course, but it makes finding reliable workers exceedingly difficult. And you believe a woman would be immune to these supernatural influences?" "I believe the right woman would have the strength of character to complete her assigned task, regardless of what her imagination might conjure up during the long hours underground. A woman who understands that financial security is worth a few weeks of discomfort and inconvenience." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, weighing her options with the careful consideration of someone who understood that this might be her last chance to avoid complete destitution. On one hand, everything about Jeremiah Blackwood's offer felt wrong. Too generous, too vague, too laden with implications she didn't fully understand. On the other hand, she was facing homelessness and starvation if she couldn't find a way to pay her debts. "I would need some time to consider your offer, Mr. Blackwood. Of course, this is not a decision to be made lightly, and I respect your prudent approach to such matters." He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the knob. "There is one other thing I should mention, Mrs. O'Sullivan. You remind me very strongly of someone I knew once, someone who was very dear to me indeed." The way he said it made Margaret's blood run cold. "Who was that?" "My late wife. She had your coloring, your bearing, your general appearance. I find the resemblance quite remarkable, and quite encouraging from the standpoint of your suitability for this position." He tipped his hat and left without another word, leaving Margaret to stare at the closed door with her heart racing for reasons she couldn't entirely name. Through the window, she watched him climb into an expensive carriage and disappear down the rutted road toward town, but the sense of his presence lingered in her parlor like smoke from a poorly tended fire. That evening, as Margaret sat by her fireplace with the foreclosure notice spread before her, she tried to make sense of what had just occurred. Everything rational told her to refuse Jeremiah Blackwood's offer. The money was too good, the conditions too strange, and the man himself radiated a kind of danger that made her primitive instincts scream warnings. But rational thinking was a luxury she could no longer afford. Tomorrow, representatives of the Territorial Bank would arrive to claim her property. By week's end, she would be homeless, friendless, and facing a winter that could very well be her last. As she prepared for bed, Margaret found herself standing before the small mirror in her bedroom, studying her reflection with new attention. auburn hair, green eyes, a face that had aged well despite the hardships of frontier life. She tried to imagine what Jeremiah Blackwood's wife had looked like. What kind of woman could have inspired such obvious devotion in a man who seemed incapable of ordinary human emotions? And she wondered, with a growing sense of dread, exactly what had happened to that beloved wife, and whether her own resemblance to the deceased woman was truly the coincidence Jeremiah claimed it to be. 3 days later, Margaret stood at the entrance to the redemption mine, carrying a canvas bag that contained everything she owned: 2 changes of work clothes, a few personal items including her mother's Bible, and the small silver locket that Jeremiah had presented to her as part of their agreement. "This belonged to someone very special to me," he'd said, his fingers lingering on hers as he placed the delicate chain in her palm. "I would be honored if you would wear it during your time in the mine, for luck." The locket was undeniably beautiful, crafted from silver that had been polished to a mirror finish and engraved with intricate patterns that spoke of expensive craftsmanship. But when Margaret opened it, she found something that made her blood run cold. A tiny daguerreotype showing the face of a young woman with auburn hair and green eyes that could have been Margaret's own. The resemblance was so striking it made her feel dizzy, as if she were looking at a photograph of herself taken in some impossible alternate timeline. The woman in the portrait was younger, perhaps in her early 20s, but they shared the same bone structure, the same shape of face, the same expressive eyes that seemed to hold secrets. "Who is she?" Margaret had asked. "Someone who understood the value of dedication," Jeremiah had replied, his voice carrying a strange note of reverence. "Someone who knew that true love requires complete commitment, regardless of the personal sacrifice involved." Now, standing at the threshold of her underground prison, Margaret touched the locket at her throat and tried to summon the courage that had brought her this far. The mine entrance yawned before her like a wound in the mountainside, its timber supports looking newer and more substantial than she'd expected from the outside. Jeremiah had provided her with the finest mining equipment money could buy: a leather safety harness that smelled of expensive oils, multiple lanterns with carefully trimmed wicks, picks and shovels that gleamed with fresh blackening. He'd also given her detailed maps of the mine's layout, marked with specific areas where she was to focus her extraction efforts. "The richest veins lie in the deepest sections," he'd explained, his finger tracing routes through a maze of tunnels that seemed to extend far beyond what any normal mining operation would require. "You'll find gold there that will make your wages seem like pocket change. Consider it a bonus for your dedication to completing the full 30 days. Nash, the promise of additional wealth should have excited her, but something about the way he'd said it made Margaret feel like she was being baited into a trap whose true nature she couldn't yet understand. The first 100 feet of the mine shaft were well lit and properly ventilated, following the standard practices of legitimate mining operations. Margaret passed several other miners heading up as their shifts ended, men with the lean, weathered look of those who spent their lives wresting precious metals from the unforgiving earth. "You the woman taking on Blackwood's special job?" asked a grizzled prospector whose arms were thick as tree trunks and whose eyes held the kind of wariness that comes from seeing too much of the world's darker corners. "I am." He shook his head slowly, the gesture carrying more weight than words. "Lady, I've been mining these hills for more than 20 years, and I've never encountered anything like what lies in those deep tunnels. The Redemption Mine ain't like other operations. Sound carries strange down there. Sometimes you hear things that can't possibly be real, voices calling from passages that lead nowhere." "What sort of voices?" The miner glanced around nervously, as if afraid that Jeremiah Blackwood might be listening from the shadows. "Women's voices mostly. Crying sometimes, screaming, and there are sections where the rock's been carved out like someone was making living quarters instead of mining for ore. Rooms with furniture, mirrors, things that got no business being 300 feet underground." Margaret felt a chill, but forced herself to maintain an expression of skeptical amusement. Sounds like the kind of stories miners tell to frighten each other during the long winter months. Maybe so. The old man adjusted his pack and prepared to resume his climb toward the surface. But if you hear someone calling your name down there, Mrs. O'Sullivan, my advice is don't answer. And if you find anything that doesn't look like standard mining equipment, he paused, searching for the right words. Well, just leave it be and keep moving. Some things are better left undisturbed. Adee. As Margaret descended deeper into the mine's bowels, she began to understand what the miner had been trying to tell her. The character of the tunnels changed dramatically once she moved beyond the areas used by the regular workforce. The professionally constructed entrance gave way to older, cruder passages that twisted and branched according to no logical pattern she could discern. The air grew thick and humid, carrying strange scents that had nothing to do with the normal odors of underground mining. Sometimes she detected something metallic, like the smell of old blood, left too long in a confined space. Other times, the air carried sweeter notes, floral perfumes that belonged in a lady's boudoir not 300 feet beneath the Colorado mountains. Her assigned shelter was located exactly where Jeremiah's maps indicated, a small chamber carved from the living rock about 400 feet down the main shaft. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to make the space comfortable, almost luxurious by mining camp standards. A narrow bed occupied one corner, covered with clean quilts that looked expensive enough to grace a wealthy woman's bedroom. A wash basin and pitcher sat on a small table, along with mirrors, brushes, and other toiletries that no male miner would ever require. Shelves had been carved into the walls to hold personal belongings, and someone had even installed hooks for hanging clothes. The attention to domestic detail was both impressive and deeply unsettling. This wasn't a temporary shelter for a worker, but a permanent residence designed for long-term occupation. But it was the mirror that gave Margaret her first real hint that something was fundamentally wrong with her situation. The glass was old, its silver backing spotted with age, and when Margaret looked into it by lamplight, she saw something that made her blood freeze in her veins. For just an instant, no more than a heartbeat, the reflection staring back at her wasn't her own face, but the face of the woman in the locket. Younger perhaps, with fewer lines around the eyes, but unmistakably the same person. Margaret blinked hard, and her own reflection returned, but the sensation of being watched by invisible eyes lingered like smoke in her lungs. She touched the locket at her throat, wondering if the resemblance between herself and Jeremiah's special someone was really as remarkable as he'd claimed, or if there were forces at work here that she was only beginning to understand. The work itself proved to be exactly as backbreaking as Jeremiah had promised. He'd provided her with detailed instructions about which tunnels to follow, which veins of ore to extract, and how much material she was expected to process each day. The gold was definitely there, more than she'd ever seen concentrated in one location, but it was located in the deepest, most remote sections of the mine, areas where the temperature never varied from a humid 75 degrees, and the silence was so complete she could hear her own heartbeat echoing off the tunnel walls. On her third day underground, Margaret made the discovery that changed everything. She'd been following a particularly promising vein of ore when her pick broke through what she'd assumed was solid rock, revealing a chamber beyond the tunnel wall. When she squeezed through the opening with her lantern held high, she found herself in a space that had clearly been carved by human hands, and not for any mining purpose she could identify. The walls were smooth, almost polished, and decorated with symbols that looked more like artistic ornamentation than the practical marks left by miners. In the center of the room sat a piece of furniture that made Margaret's breath catch. An elegant wooden chair with velvet upholstery, the kind of delicate feminine piece that belonged in a wealthy woman's private sitting room. Beside the chair was a small table holding items that had no business existing 300 feet underground. A silver hairbrush with an ornate handle, an elaborate hand mirror framed in gold, and a crystal bottle of expensive French perfume. When Margaret lifted the perfume bottle, the scent that emerged was hauntingly familiar. The same floral fragrance she'd been detecting in the mine's air since her first day underground. The hairbrush contained long strands of auburn hair that matched the color and texture of her own exactly. Margaret backed away from the table, her lantern casting wild shadows on the chamber walls as her hand shook with growing fear. This wasn't a mining operation. This was something else entirely, something designed for the comfort and confinement of a woman who looked exactly like her. She was preparing to flee when she noticed something else, a small opening in the far wall, partially concealed behind a length of faded cloth. When she pulled the fabric aside, she discovered a tunnel that led deeper into the mountain's heart, toward chambers that her instincts warned her were filled with secrets too dangerous for any living person to know. Against every rational thought screaming at her to return to her assigned work area, Margaret followed the tunnel into the darkness beyond. The hidden tunnel led Margaret through a warren of interconnected chambers, each one revealing new evidence that the redemption mine was far more than a simple gold extraction operation. Someone had spent years, perhaps decades, carving out this underground kingdom, creating a network of rooms and passages that served purposes having nothing to do with mining. The fourth chamber she discovered made her stomach lurch with recognition and absolute terror. The walls were lined with portraits in elaborate frames, each one illuminated by carefully placed lanterns that burned with the steady flame of expensive whale oil. There were dozens of them, maybe 50 or more, all showing women between the ages of 25 and 50, professional daguerreotypes, the kind that cost significant money to commission and even more to frame with such obvious care. And every single woman in those portraits looked like Margaret. Not identical, some were blondes, others brunettes, and their facial features varied in subtle but noticeable ways. But they all shared the same general bone structure, the same shape of face, the same large, expressive eyes that seemed to follow Margaret as she moved through the gallery. It was as if someone had spent years collecting images of variations on a single theme, assembling a catalogue of women who fit very specific physical criteria. At the center of the gallery hung the largest portrait of all, showing a woman who could have been Margaret's twin sister. The nameplate beneath it, engraved on a brass plaque that gleamed like gold, read, "Rose Blackwood, beloved wife, 1851-1872. Margaret's hands trembled as she lifted her lantern to study Rose Blackwood's face more closely. The resemblance was so striking, it made her feel dizzy, as if she were looking at a photograph of herself taken in some impossible alternate timeline. But more disturbing were the other details she could make out in the portrait's background. Rose was wearing the same silver locket that now hung around Margaret's throat, and her dress was made of expensive silk that spoke of wealth and privilege. Her eyes, however, told a different story. Despite the formal pose and elegant clothing, Rose Blackwood's expression held barely concealed terror, the look of someone who understood that she was trapped in circumstances beyond her control. Moving through the gallery with growing dread, Margaret began to notice patterns in the other portraits that made her skin crawl. Many of the women wore similar lockets, their hands positioned in ways that suggested they hadn't been willing participants in the photography sessions. Several showed signs of physical distress, dark circles under their eyes, an unhealthy thinness that spoke of poor nutrition and constant stress, the hollow-eyed look of people who had abandoned hope. Some of the portraits bore dates spanning nearly 2 decades, suggesting that whoever had assembled this collection had been pursuing his obsession for a very long time. The most recent photographs were dated just months ago, and Margaret realized with growing horror that she was looking at a systematic record of victims rather than willing subjects. At the far end of the gallery, Margaret discovered a writing desk equipped with fine paper, expensive ink, and several leather-bound journals. Her hands shook violently as she opened the first journal and began to read by lantern light. struggling to make out the handwriting of someone whose emotional state had clearly deteriorated over time. Day 1. Mr. Blackwood has offered me employment in his mine. The pay is more generous than anything I could earn elsewhere in the territory. My husband is dead. My children have moved east, seeking opportunities, and I have few alternatives. I have accepted his offer. Day 3. There are strange things in this mine. Rooms that serve no mining purpose, furnished as if someone were preparing for a long-term guest. I found a chamber filled with women's clothing, all laid out as if someone were expecting a visitor. The dresses are beautiful but old-fashioned, and they would fit me perfectly. Day 7. Mr. Blackwood visits me every evening now, bringing gifts that seem far too expensive for a mine worker to receive. Perfume, jewelry, flowers picked from his private greenhouse. He speaks constantly of his dead wife, Rose, and how much I remind him of her. His attention makes me deeply uncomfortable, but I desperately need this employment. Day 12. I found more chambers today, including one that contained nothing but mirrors, dozens of them, arranged so that they reflect a person's image back from every conceivable angle. Mr. Blackwood says Rose used to spend hours looking at herself in those mirrors, admiring the gifts he'd given her. He suggests that I should try on some of her dresses. Day 18. Something is terribly wrong here. I attempted to leave the mine early today, claiming illness, but discovered that the entrance had been sealed by what appeared to be a natural rockfall. Mr. Blackwood assures me it's temporary, that his men will clear the obstruction as soon as weather permits. But I heard them working outside my chamber last night, and they weren't clearing rocks, they were placing them. Day 24. God help me. I finally understand what's happening here. The women in the portraits, they were all trapped here just like me. Jeremiah Blackwood has been collecting us, keeping us like specimens in his underground museum. I found evidence of what happened to the others, and I have to find a way out before he decides my usefulness has ended. The entry terminated abruptly in a splash of ink, as if the writer had been interrupted mid-sentence by something too terrible to record. Margaret flipped through more journals with growing horror, finding similar accounts from other women. Each story began with desperation and a generous job offer from Jeremiah Blackwood. Each progressed through growing unease to stark terror as the writer realized the true nature of her situation. And each ended the same way, with an abrupt final entry that suggested the author had met some terrible fate before she could complete her record. The last journal was different. The handwriting was more elegant and educated, written in the careful script of someone who'd received formal schooling in penmanship and composition. The voice that emerged from the pages carried a familiar Eastern accent that reminded Margaret painfully of Jeremiah's own cultured speech patterns. My name is Rose Blackwood, and if you are reading these words, then you are likely the latest woman my husband has chosen to replace me in his collection. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Rose Blackwood wasn't dead, or at least she hadn't been dead when she wrote this account. I was 19 years old when Jeremiah married me in Boston, the daughter of a merchant family that had fallen on difficult times. He was charming, wealthy, and sophisticated, everything a young woman dreams of in a husband. I believed myself fortunate to have caught his attention among all the eligible young ladies in our social circle. What I didn't know was that I was not his first wife, nor even his second. Jeremiah Blackwood has been marrying and collecting women for longer than I can calculate, drawn always to those who fit his very specific physical preferences. He brought me west under the pretense of starting a new life in the Colorado Territory, where his mining investments were making him wealthy beyond imagination. Instead, he imprisoned me in these chambers beneath the Redemption Mine, where I have lived for the past 15 years like a doll in his private collection. For the first few years, I played the role he demanded, the devoted wife, grateful for his attention and gifts, content to spend my days in the underground rooms he had furnished for my comfort. I wore the clothes he selected, posed for portraits when he demanded, and pretended to find happiness in my golden cage. But as time passed, Jeremiah's obsession began to change. I was no longer the young bride he had married, and my aging seemed to disturb him greatly. He began to speak of finding someone who could recapture the beauty I had possessed in my youth, someone who could remind him of why he had fallen in love with me in the first place. The other women you have seen in the portraits were not wives. They were substitutes he collected when his fascination with me began to fade. Each one resembled me in some significant way, and each one disappeared when Jeremiah grew tired of the pretense. If you are reading this journal, it means he has begun the process again. You have approximately 30 days before he makes his final decision about your suitability as my replacement. If you please him sufficiently, you will spend the rest of your life in these chambers, playing the role of the perfect wife for an audience of one. If you disappoint him in any way, there is a way out, but it requires more courage than I have ever possessed. Hidden behind the large mirror in what he calls the bridal chamber, you will find a tunnel that leads to an abandoned mining shaft on the eastern slope of the mountain. I have been working to clear this passage during the years of my captivity, removing rocks and debris whenever Jeremiah's schedule allowed me to work unobserved. The tunnel is nearly complete now, but I have never dared to use it myself. Jeremiah watches me too closely, and he would certainly notice my absence long enough for me to reach the surface. But perhaps someone younger and stronger could succeed where I have failed. Save yourself if you can, and if possible, try to prevent other women from sharing our fate. Jeremiah Blackwood's madness grows stronger with each passing year, and I fear there is no limit to the number of innocent lives he will sacrifice to feed his obsession. Written in the 15th year of my captivity, Rose Blackwood Margaret closed the journal with shaking hands that could barely hold the leather cover steady. 15 years. Rose Blackwood had been trapped in this underground hell for 15 years, and according to the date on the journal's final entry, she might still be alive somewhere in these labyrinthine tunnels. The sound of footsteps echoing through the hidden passages made Margaret's blood freeze in her veins. Someone was approaching through the gallery, moving with the confidence of long familiarity through chambers that were supposed to be secret. She quickly extinguished her lantern and crouched behind the writing desk, clutching Rose's journal to her chest, while her heart hammered so loudly she was certain it would give away her location. Through the absolute darkness, she could see the approaching glow of another light source, and soon she heard a voice that made her skin crawl with recognition and terror. "Margaret, my dear." Jeremiah Blackwood's cultured voice echoed through the portrait gallery. "I know you're down here somewhere. There's really no need to hide from me. We're going to have this conversation eventually." Margaret pressed herself deeper into the shadows behind the writing desk, hardly daring to breathe as Jeremiah's lantern light grew stronger. Her mind raced through the layout of chambers she'd explored, calculating distances to the various passages that might offer escape routes. But she'd have to cross open ground to reach any of them, and something told her that Jeremiah knew these tunnels far better than she ever could. "I must say, I'm genuinely impressed by your thoroughness," Jeremiah continued, his voice carrying the same conversational tone he might use to discuss the weather or the latest territorial politics. "Most women don't make it past the first hidden chamber before they become completely overwhelmed by the implications of what they've discovered. But you've conducted quite an extensive exploration, haven't you, my dear?" The light was closer now, casting dancing shadows across the gallery walls as Jeremiah moved methodically through the space. Margaret could see his silhouette elongated and distorted by the lantern's glow, and in his free hand she glimpsed something that made her stomach clench with pure terror: a length of rope, professionally knotted in a way that suggested considerable experience with restraining unwilling subjects. "You know, Rose, and I hope you don't mind if I call you Rose, since the resemblance between you two is so remarkably striking. Rose was quite the explorer too when she first arrived here. Always curious about everything, constantly poking into corners where she didn't belong, asking questions that demonstrated an unfortunate lack of trust in my judgment. Margaret noticed that something fundamental had changed in his voice. The careful courtesy that had characterized their previous interactions was beginning to slip away, revealing something much colder and more calculating beneath the surface. I found her curiosity charming at first, I'll admit. There's something delightfully feminine about a woman who wants to understand every detail of her environment. But curiosity can become quite tiresome in a wife, don't you think? A woman should learn to know her proper place in the world and be content within the boundaries that loving guidance provides. The lantern light swept across the chamber in a systematic pattern, and Margaret held her breath as it passed within inches of her hiding spot. Jeremiah was moving slowly and methodically, checking each corner and alcove with the patient thoroughness of an experienced hunter who knew his prey had nowhere to run. "I see you've been reading Rose's journals. How delightfully literary of you." "She always was a gifted writer, my dear Rose. Such a vivid imagination, though I'm afraid she developed a tendency toward melodrama in her later entries. 15 years of comfortable living in the lap of luxury will do that to some women. They begin to see themselves as prisoners rather than cherished and protected companions." Margaret's heart was hammering so loudly against her ribs that she was certain he must be able to hear it echoing off the chamber walls. Jeremiah was now standing directly in front of the writing desk, his lantern casting wild, dancing shadows across the portraits of his victims that lined the gallery walls. "Of course, Rose is no longer with us to enjoy the fruits of our partnership," he continued with casual indifference, as if discussing the departure of a household servant rather than the death of a human being. Such a tragic loss, really. She grew increasingly difficult in her final years, refusing to wear the beautiful clothes I selected for her, breaking the precious gifts I brought to demonstrate my affection, even attempting to damage her own face so that she would no longer be suitable for my purposes. He paused, and Margaret could hear him shifting position, moving around the desk with predatory patience. Eventually, I was forced to end our relationship. But that's the wonderful thing about this territory, Margaret. There are always new women arriving, women in desperate circumstances who understand the true value of a generous offer from a gentleman of means. Women who bear a striking resemblance to my beloved Rose in her prime. The lantern light began moving away from her hiding spot, and Margaret dared to hope that he might be preparing to leave. But then Jeremiah's voice came from a completely different direction. He had somehow circled around behind her position without making a sound. "Did you really think you could hide from me in my own domain, my dear?" Strong hands seized her shoulders and hauled her upright with shocking force. Margaret found herself staring directly into Jeremiah Blackwood's face, and what she saw there was far more terrifying than simple madness. His eyes held the calculating intelligence of an apex predator, completely rational and utterly without conscience or human empathy. "There's my beautiful Rose," he said softly, his fingers trailing along her cheek with a gentleness that made her skin crawl. "You've been very naughty, exploring areas that are off limits without asking permission first. But I forgive you completely. After all, you're still learning the rules that will govern our life together." Margaret jerked away from his touch with violent revulsion. "My name is Margaret O'Sullivan, and I'm leaving this cursed mine right now." Jeremiah's laugh was genuinely amused, the sound of someone who had just heard a particularly entertaining joke. "Oh, my dear woman, I'm afraid that's simply not possible. You see, you signed a legally binding contract to work in this mine for 30 consecutive days. We're only on day 7 of that agreement. Breaking such a contract would constitute a serious breach of trust, not to mention a violation of territorial employment law. You can keep your damn money. I don't want any part of this madness." "I'm afraid it's not about the money anymore, Margaret. You've seen far too much, learned things that were meant to remain private between us. And frankly, You've exceeded my most optimistic expectations in ways that I find quite stimulating." He gestured around the portrait gallery with obvious pride, like a collector showing off his most prized acquisitions. "You see, most women become completely hysterical when they discover my collection. They start screaming, crying, trying to escape in ways that make them entirely unsuitable for the kind of long-term companionship I'm seeking. But you approach the situation with admirable analytical thinking. You studied the portraits, read the journals, tried to understand the full scope of what you'd discovered. You demonstrated Rose's intelligence as well as her remarkable beauty." Margaret backed away from him, but there was nowhere to go in the confined space. The chamber walls seemed to be pressing in around her, and she could feel the crushing weight of the entire mountain suspended above her head. "What happened to the other women, the ones in all these portraits?" "They disappointed me," Jeremiah replied, with the casual indifference of someone discussing the weather. "Failed to meet the exacting standards that Rose had established during our years together. Some proved to be too emotionally weak, others too defiant for their own good. A few showed considerable promise initially, but proved inconsistent in their demonstrations of affection and gratitude." He moved closer, and Margaret caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something else, something metallic and deeply unpleasant that reminded her of the slaughterhouses back in the more civilized parts of the country. "But you, my dear Margaret, you have the genuine potential to be everything Rose was in her prime, and perhaps even more. You possess her courage, her quick intelligence, her absolutely stunning beauty. With proper guidance and encouragement, I believe you could become the perfect companion I've been seeking all these years. I will never be your prisoner, you monster." "Prisoner?" Jeremiah looked genuinely hurt by the accusation, his expression shifting to that of a misunderstood benefactor. "My dear woman, you completely misunderstand the nature of what I'm offering you. I don't want a prisoner. I want a true partner, a devoted wife who appreciates the finer things that life can offer, who understands that genuine love sometimes requires total dedication." Margaret thought of the rope in his hand, the sealed mine entrance above, the carefully arranged bones that were undoubtedly scattered through these tunnels like some macabre museum display. "And if I refuse your generous offer?" Jeremiah's expression didn't change in any obvious way, but something cold and utterly merciless flickered behind his eyes for just an instant. "Then you would be choosing to join the women who ultimately disappointed me. But I really don't think you'll make that choice, Margaret. You're far too intelligent to throw away your life over a simple point of misguided pride." He stepped even closer, close enough that she could feel the unnatural heat radiating from his body. "Besides, what's really waiting for you up there in the surface world? Poverty, crushing loneliness, a slow, degrading death in some frontier hovel. I'm offering you luxury beyond imagination, comfort, security, and the devoted attention of a man who understands your true worth." His voice dropped to an intimate whisper. "All I ask in return is companionship, loyalty, the understanding that what we build together transcends the petty conventions that limit ordinary relationships." Margaret's mind raced as she tried to buy time, searching for any strategy that might help her survive this encounter. She needed to reach Rose's escape tunnel, but first she had to find a way to get past Jeremiah without triggering the violent response she could see lurking just beneath his civilized facade. I need time to think about this properly, Mr. Blackwood. This is a very significant decision. Jeremiah, please. We're going to be much closer than formal titles would suggest." His smile was indulgent, almost paternal. "And of course you need time to consider everything I've shared with you. This is indeed a life-changing decision, and I want you to make it with complete freedom and understanding." He stepped back slightly, giving her room to breathe. "We have 23 more days to get to know each other more intimately. I think you'll find my company quite pleasant once you fully accept the parameters of our future relationship." Jeremiah turned toward one of the gallery's exits, then paused as if remembering something important. "Oh, and Margaret? Please don't waste time and energy attempting to leave the mine before our agreement is complete. The entrance will remain sealed until the full 30 days have passed. I would truly hate for you to injure yourself trying something foolishly heroic." As his footsteps faded into the darkness beyond the portrait gallery, Margaret sank to her knees beside the writing desk. 23 days. 23 days to find Rose's escape tunnel, figure out how to navigate it safely, and somehow survive long enough to expose Jeremiah Blackwood's crimes to the outside world. She opened Rose's journal again, searching desperately for any additional clue that might help her escape the fate of the women whose portraits watched her from the gallery walls with their dead, hopeless eyes. The next several days passed in a nightmarish routine that tested every ounce of Margaret's mental and physical endurance. By day, she performed the mining work that Jeremiah expected, extracting gold from the deepest tunnels while fighting the constant sensation that she was being watched by invisible eyes. By night, she explored the hidden chambers with desperate urgency, searching for Rose's escape tunnel, while trying to understand the full scope of Jeremiah's underground kingdom. What she discovered during those clandestine explorations was far worse than anything she could have imagined. The network of secret chambers extended much further than she'd initially realized. Beyond the portrait gallery lay dozens of additional rooms, each one serving a specific purpose in Jeremiah's elaborate fantasy. There was a dining room furnished with a table set for two, the plates and silverware carefully arranged as if awaiting guests who would never arrive. A library filled with books on topics ranging from poetry to anatomy, many bearing marginalia in Jeremiah's precise handwriting. A music room containing a piano that had somehow been transported 300 feet underground, its keys yellowed with age and neglect. But it was the rooms clearly designed for Rose's original captivity that made Margaret's blood run cold. A bedroom that was a perfect replica of a wealthy woman's private chamber, complete with silk wallpaper, Persian rugs, and furniture that belonged in a Boston mansion rather than a Colorado mine. A dressing room lined with mirrors and filled with gowns spanning 2 decades of fashion, all in Rose's size and all showing signs of having been worn. A sitting room where Rose had apparently spent her days, furnished with delicate chairs and tables that bore the scars of someone's desperate attempts to find escape, or at least temporary relief from crushing despair. In the sitting room, Margaret found more of Rose's journals, chronicling years of psychological torture disguised as devoted marriage. The entries painted a picture of gradual mental deterioration as Rose struggled to maintain her sanity while playing the role Jeremiah demanded. Year 3. I have learned not to resist when he brings the photographer. The sessions are easier if I simply pose as directed and try to think of other things. He has commissioned at least a dozen portraits this year alone. I think he fears that I am aging and wants to preserve my appearance while I still resemble the young woman he married. Year 7. The gifts have become more elaborate, but also more disturbing. Today he presented me with a necklace made from pearls that once belonged to his previous Rose. His exact words. When I asked what happened to her, he simply smiled and said that she had become unsuitable for his purposes. I am beginning to understand that I'm not the first woman to occupy these chambers. Year 10. He brought another woman down today, claimed she was a temporary worker, but I could see the truth in her eyes when she looked at me. She resembles me so closely that we could be sisters. He is planning to replace me, and I fear what will happen when he no longer needs 2 versions of the same woman. Year 12. The new woman disappeared after 6 days. When I asked about her, Jeremiah said she had failed to appreciate the opportunities he offered. I found blood on his clothes that evening, and he spent hours cleaning his hands with an intensity that suggested they had been contaminated by something more than mining work. Year 15. I have begun work on the tunnel behind the mirror. It may take years to complete, but it represents my only hope of escape. If I am discovered, I know he will kill me. But I can no longer live with the knowledge that other women will suffer my fate unless someone takes action to stop him. Margaret closed the journal, her hands shaking with a combination of rage and terror. Rose had been forced to watch Jeremiah murder women who looked like her, knowing that her own survival depended on maintaining the fiction that she was a willing participant in his madness. On her 9th day underground, Margaret finally found what she'd been searching for. The mirror in the bridal chamber was exactly as Rose had described, a massive piece of silvered glass in an ornate frame, positioned to reflect the canopied bed from multiple angles. But when Margaret examined it more closely, she discovered that the frame was mounted on carefully concealed hinges that allowed the entire mirror to swing aside like a door. Behind it lay Rose's escape tunnel. The passage was narrow and rough-hewn, carved from the living rock, with tools that had left distinctive chisel marks on every surface. Someone had spent years working on this tunnel, removing debris one handful at a time and carefully disposing of the evidence to avoid detection. The work represented a level of patience and determination that spoke of absolute desperation. The efforts of someone who knew that escape was literally a matter of life and death. Margaret squeezed through the opening with her lantern held ahead of her, following a passage that sloped gradually upward toward what she hoped was freedom. The tunnel showed clear evidence of recent work, fresh tool marks, recently moved stones, areas where the passage had been widened to allow easier movement. After what felt like 200 yards of careful progress, the tunnel opened into a natural cave system. Here, the evidence of habitation became unmistakable. A crude bed made from mining blankets, a cache of preserved food, containers for water collection, and the accumulated debris of someone who had been living in hiding for an extended period. A sound from deeper in the cave system made Margaret freeze, the soft shuffle of footsteps moving cautiously through the darkness, accompanied by the barely audible whisper of someone trying to remain undetected. "Who's there?" Margaret called out softly, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. The footsteps stopped immediately. For several long moments, the only sound was the steady drip of water from somewhere in the cave's depths. Then a voice answered. A woman's voice, hoarse with disuse but unmistakably educated and refined. "You shouldn't be here. He'll come looking for you, and if he finds this place..." Margaret moved toward the voice, her lantern casting wild shadows on the uneven cave walls. "Are you Rose? Rose Blackwood?" A sharp intake of breath, followed by a long silence. Then, "How do you know that name? Who are you?" "My name is Margaret O'Sullivan. I read your journal in the portrait gallery. I know about Jeremiah, about what he's been doing to women like us." A figure stepped hesitantly into the lantern's glow, and Margaret gasped at what she saw. The woman before her might once have been beautiful, but years of underground living had extracted a terrible toll. Her hair was completely white, despite her relatively young age. Her skin pale as parchment from lack of sunlight, and her clothes were little more than rags held together by careful mending. But her eyes were intelligent, alert, and filled with a desperate hope that she was clearly afraid to embrace. "You're the woman he hired for the 30-day contract," Rose said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. How long have you been hiding in these caves?" 3 years, Rose replied, her voice carrying the flat exhaustion of someone who had given up most of her illusions about rescue or escape. "Ever since I managed to complete the tunnel and break free from his collection, I've been living here like some primitive creature, watching him bring other women into the mine, listening to their screams when they finally understand what he intends for them." Margaret felt sick with horror and guilt. "Why haven't you tried to get help, alert the authorities about what he's doing?" Rose laughed, but there was no humor in the sound, only bitter understanding of realities that Margaret was just beginning to grasp. "My dear woman, Jeremiah Blackwood is the authority in this territory. He owns the sheriff, the mayor, half the territorial legislature, and most of the judges. Who exactly would believe the testimony of a woman who's supposed to be dead? And even if someone did believe me, what evidence could I provide that Jeremiah hasn't had years to destroy or explain away? Then how do we stop him? How do we prevent him from doing this to other women? We don't. Rose's voice carried the absolute certainty of someone who had spent years contemplating this exact question. We survive. We hide. We try to stay alive long enough for him to lose interest in us and move on to some other obsession. Margaret studied Rose's face in the flickering lantern light. The woman had clearly been beautiful once, but years of fear, malnutrition, and the constant stress of hiding had carved deep lines around her eyes and mouth. She looked far older than the 43 she should be if she'd been 19 when Jeremiah married her. How many other women have there been since you escaped, besides me? Rose was quiet for a long moment, as if she were counting ghosts. 7 that I know of. 7 women who reminded him of me in some way, who caught his attention because they fit his very specific physical requirements. 3 of them broke completely within the first week, started screaming and couldn't stop until he ended their suffering. The others held out longer, but none of them survived the full 30 days. What happens after 30 days? What's the significance of that timeline? Rose led her deeper into the cave system, through passages that showed clear evidence of careful excavation and improvement. If he decides you're suitable after the trial period, you become his new permanent collection piece. You live in those chambers forever, playing the role of the devoted wife for an audience of one. If you displease him in any way, she gestured toward a side passage that led into deeper darkness. There are places in this mountain where screams can't be heard, even by the miners working the surface shafts. Places where he can take his time with the disposal process. Margaret felt cold certainty settling in her stomach like lead. Show me. Rose hesitated. Are you certain you want to see? Some knowledge can't be forgotten once you possess it. I need to understand exactly what we're facing. Rose led her through a series of increasingly narrow passages, some natural, others clearly enlarged by human hands over many years. The air grew colder as they climbed, and Margaret began to detect the first hints of surface air movement. They were getting closer to the outside world, but their destination lay in a different direction entirely. In the sealed chamber that required moving carefully placed stones to access, Margaret's lantern revealed a sight that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. Human remains, carefully arranged and sorted according to some system that spoke of methodical organization rather than hasty disposal. Some of the bones still bore fragments of cloth, the remnants of dresses similar to those hanging in Jeremiah's underground wardrobe. The women who disappointed him, Rose said simply. He keeps them here like trophies, evidence of his conquests. Sometimes he brings his current wife to see them, as a reminder of what happens to women who don't appreciate his generosity. Margaret forced herself to count the skulls, fighting down waves of nausea as she tried to calculate how many lives had been lost to feed Jeremiah's obsession. 11 complete skeletons, plus fragments that suggested there might be more remains scattered through other chambers. We have to do something, Margaret whispered. We can't let this continue. What exactly would you suggest? Rose asked, her voice carrying years of frustrated desperation. Even if we could somehow reach the surface, even if we could find someone willing to listen to our story, Jeremiah would simply deny everything. He's had years to perfect his explanations. We're delusional women who've been living wild in the mountains, probably driven insane by isolation and hardship. Who would believe us over a respected businessman with political connections throughout the territory? Margaret stared at the carefully arranged bones, her mind working through possibilities and rejecting them one by one. Then, slowly, an idea began to form. Desperate and dangerous, but possibly their only hope of stopping Jeremiah's crimes. What if we didn't try to convince anyone else? She said quietly. What if we dealt with Jeremiah ourselves? Rose stared at her with a mixture of horror and desperate hope. You're talking about murder. I'm talking about justice, Margaret replied firmly. And self-defense. How many more women is he going to kill if we don't find a way to stop him? Even if we could. How? He's stronger than both of us combined, and he knows these tunnels better than anyone alive. Margaret continued studying the bone chamber, her mind working through the tactical challenges. Maybe we don't need to overpower him physically. Maybe we need to use his obsessions against him, turn his own madness into a weapon. She turned to face Rose directly. Tell me everything you know about his routines, his weaknesses, his patterns of behavior. If we're going to do this, we need to understand our enemy better than he understands himself. Over the next several hours, crouched in the darkness of Rose's hidden cave, the two women began planning what they both knew was likely to be their final gamble. A desperate attempt to end Jeremiah Blackwood's reign of terror before he could claim any more victims. Over the following days, Margaret and Rose developed a plan that was equal parts desperate and audacious, requiring Margaret to play the most challenging role of her life, while Rose used her intimate knowledge of Jeremiah's psychological patterns to prepare an elaborate trap. The key to their strategy lay in understanding what truly motivated Jeremiah's behavior. After years of captivity, Rose had gained insights into his twisted psychology that no outside observer could ever possess. He doesn't just want submission, Rose explained, as they huddled in the cave system, planning by the light of carefully shielded lanterns. He needs to feel like he's orchestrating a genuine seduction, like his victims are falling in love with him of their own free will. The whole elaborate process, the 30-day trial period, the gradual revelation of his collection, the illusion of choice he offers, it's all designed to make him feel like a romantic hero rather than a kidnapper and murderer. So I need to convince him that I'm genuinely attracted to him. More than that, you need to make him believe that you're experiencing the same transformation Rose did in the early days of their marriage, moving from initial resistance through gradual acceptance to complete devotion. Jeremiah's greatest weakness is his vanity. He truly believes that any woman, given enough time and exposure to his charm and generosity, will come to worship him. Margaret thought about this as she made her way back through the mirror passage to the underground chambers. Playing the role of a woman slowly succumbing to Stockholm Syndrome would require every ounce of acting ability she possessed, but it was their only realistic chance of getting close enough to Jeremiah to implement their plan. When Jeremiah arrived for his evening visit, a routine that Rose had warned her to expect, Margaret was ready for the performance of her lifetime. She had spent considerable time preparing for this encounter, selecting one of the more elegant dresses from Rose's extensive wardrobe and arranging her hair in a style that matched one of the portraits in the gallery. The effect was striking and clearly designed to appeal to Jeremiah's obsession with recreating his idealized version of Rose. "My dear Margaret," he breathed when he entered the bedroom chamber, his eyes lighting up with obvious pleasure as he took in her transformed appearance. "You look absolutely radiant. That dress is particularly becoming on you." "I've been thinking about our conversation in the gallery," Margaret said, keeping her voice soft and uncertain, like someone who was wrestling with conflicting emotions. "About the loneliness that's waiting for me on the surface, about the security and comfort you're offering here." Jeremiah moved closer, his expression eager and anticipatory. "And what conclusions have you reached, my dear?" "I'm beginning to understand why Rose was so devoted to you for so many years." Margaret let her fingers trace the locket at her throat, a gesture she'd practiced to suggest growing attachment to the symbols of Jeremiah's affection. "There's something about this place, about you. It makes me feel protected in a way I haven't experienced since Patrick died." It was exactly what Jeremiah wanted to hear, and Margaret could see the genuine joy that transformed his features. For just a moment, His carefully maintained mask of civilized control slipped away, revealing something that might have been sincere emotion beneath the calculated predation. "I knew you would understand, given sufficient time to adjust to the realities of our situation," he said. "You possess Rose's intelligence and intuition, her capacity for recognizing genuine devotion when it's offered." Over the following days, Margaret played her role with increasing sophistication, allowing Jeremiah to escort her through his underground kingdom, while she listened with apparent fascination to his explanations of the improvements he'd made over the years. She admired the portrait gallery, asked carefully crafted questions about the women depicted there, and accepted his heavily edited explanations with what appeared to be growing trust. They were all special in their own ways, he told her during one of these tours, his arm around her waist as they stood before Rose's portrait. Each one possessed certain qualities that reminded me of what Rose had been in her prime. But none of them had the depth of character that I see in you, the potential for the kind of true partnership that transcends ordinary relationships. Margaret forced herself to lean into his embrace, fighting every instinct that screamed at her to run. "What would such a partnership involve? What would you expect from me?" "Complete devotion," Jeremiah replied without hesitation. "Absolute trust. The understanding that our love exists on a plane far above the petty conventions that restrict ordinary couples. We would be like gods in our underground paradise, free from the corrupting influences of the surface world and its small-minded inhabitants." It was during these carefully orchestrated conversations that Margaret learned the practical details she and Rose needed to finalize their trap. The locations of Jeremiah's various supply caches, the timing of mining operations above that might provide cover for any noise they needed to make, and most importantly, his detailed plans for her graduation ceremony. On day 27, Jeremiah explained with obvious excitement he would present her with the choice that all his candidates eventually faced: remain with him forever as his devoted companion, or attempt to return to the surface world and forfeit the protection and security he offered. What he didn't say explicitly, but what Rose had already confirmed, was that no woman had ever been allowed to leave, regardless of her stated choice. "The ceremony takes place in what I call the sacred chamber," he told her, his eyes bright with anticipation that made Margaret's skin crawl. "The place where Rose and I celebrated our true wedding, far from the corrupting influences of conventional society and meaningless legal formalities." And Margaret had already seen the sacred chamber during her explorations, a large natural cavern deep in the mine's heart, furnished with an altar that looked suspiciously like a butcher's block and decorated with personal belongings that had obviously been taken from his previous victims. According to Rose, it was there that Jeremiah enacted his grotesque wedding ceremonies before disposing of the women who inevitably disappointed him. It was also there that they would spring their carefully planned trap. The key to their strategy lay in exploiting Jeremiah's need for ritual and ceremony. He had to feel like he was in complete control of the situation, that everything was proceeding according to his carefully orchestrated script. Only when he was at his most confident and least guarded would they have any chance of success. But first, they had to survive the next few days without arousing his suspicions. Margaret continued her performance as the gradually seduced victim, while Rose made the final preparations that would determine whether they lived to see another sunrise or joined the women whose bones decorated Jeremiah's underground charnel house. Day 26 arrived with the weight of impending doom hanging over Margaret like a physical presence. She had spent the morning performing her assigned mining work with mechanical precision, while her mind focused obsessively on the plan she and Rose had developed. By evening, either Jeremiah Blackwood would be dead, or she would join the collection of bones in his secret chamber. Jeremiah arrived earlier than usual, carrying what appeared to be a wedding dress from an earlier era. White silk, yellowed with age and decorated with lace that had probably been beautiful when it was new. Margaret recognized it immediately from one of the portraits in the gallery. It was the dress Rose had worn for her true wedding 15 years ago. "Tomorrow is indeed a very special day," Jeremiah said, his voice thick with emotional anticipation that made Margaret's flesh crawl. "I want you to wear this for our ceremony." Rose looked absolutely radiant in it, and I have every confidence that it will be equally magnificent on you. Margaret accepted the dress with hands that she willed to remain steady. "It's beautiful, Jeremiah, but I have to ask you something that's been troubling me. What really happened to Rose? The original Rose, I mean." For just an instant, something dangerous flickered behind his eyes, a glimpse of the monster that lurked beneath his carefully maintained facade of genteel civilization. Then his expression softened into the patient condescension of a teacher, explaining a difficult concept to a particularly slow student. Rose evolved, you might say. In the end, she lost her appreciation for the extraordinary life we had built together. She became obsessed with leaving our paradise, with returning to a surface world that had absolutely nothing of value to offer her. I tried my best to help her understand what she would be losing, but eventually... He shrugged with apparent sadness. "Sometimes love requires making very difficult decisions." "Did you kill her, Jeremiah?" He looked genuinely shocked by the directness of the question. "Kill her? My dear Margaret, I would never harm someone I loved with such complete devotion. But when Rose made it clear that she could never be truly happy as my wife, when she demonstrated that she lacked the capacity for the kind of transcendent love I was offering, I released her from our arrangement." The euphemism was chilling in its casual delivery. Margaret now understood with perfect clarity that in Jeremiah's twisted worldview, murder was simply another form of kindness, freeing his victims from their failure to appreciate the gifts he offered. "And if I decided that I wanted to leave, return to the surface? But why would you possibly want that?" Jeremiah moved closer, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders with possessive certainty. "You've seen everything I'm offering: luxury, security, comfort, and the devoted attention of a man who understands your true worth. Why would you choose poverty, loneliness, and degradation over paradise?" Margaret let doubt and uncertainty creep into her voice, playing the role of someone wrestling with a genuinely difficult decision. It's such a permanent commitment. Forever is a very long time to spend in one place." "Yes, it is," Jeremiah agreed, his grip on her shoulders tightening perceptibly. "That's precisely why tomorrow's ceremony is so important. It will help you understand the true nature of our commitment to each other, the permanence of the bond we're creating." After he left, Margaret met Rose in the cave system for what they both knew might be their final conversation as free women. They had spent days positioning supplies and preparing their trap, but looking at Rose's gaunt face in the lamplight, Margaret wondered if they were simply planning an elaborate form of suicide. "Are you absolutely certain about this plan?" Rose asked, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had survived far more than any human being should have to endure. "Once we begin this process, there will be no turning back. If we fail, if something goes wrong, then we die," Margaret finished. "But we're going to die anyway if we don't make this attempt. At least this way we have a chance to save the women who will come after us, to prevent other families from losing daughters and wives to his madness." Rose nodded slowly, her expression resolving into something approaching peace. "Then may God have mercy on our souls, because we're about to commit murder." "We're about to execute a monster," Margaret corrected. "There's a difference." The next morning, day 27 of her contract, dawned grey and cold on the surface, though such weather had little meaning in the perpetual darkness of the deep mine. Margaret dressed in Rose's wedding gown, with hands that trembled only slightly, preparing herself to play the most crucial role of her life. The dress fit perfectly, which somehow made the whole situation even more disturbing. As she looked at herself in the mirror, Margaret saw Rose Blackwood staring back, or perhaps one of the other victims, all of them blending together in death as they had in Jeremiah's obsession. Jeremiah arrived at midday, dressed in his finest suit and carrying a bouquet of dried flowers that might have been beautiful 20 years ago, but now looked like a funeral arrangement. His eyes glowed with unholy joy as he took in Margaret's appearance in the wedding dress. "Absolutely perfect," he breathed. "You look exactly as Rose did on our wedding day, young, beautiful, and ready to begin our eternal partnership in paradise." He offered her his arm with the elaborate courtesy of a genuine gentleman, and together they walked through the underground passages toward the sacred chamber. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs so violently that she was afraid he might hear it, but she forced herself to maintain the expression of nervous anticipation that Jeremiah expected to see. The sacred chamber was exactly as Rose had described. A large natural cavern illuminated by dozens of candles and furnished with the macabre altar where Jeremiah conducted his ceremonies. The walls were decorated with personal items stolen from his victims: jewelry, photographs, locks of hair, and other trophies of his conquests arranged like a shrine to his own twisted devotion. But Margaret also noticed the modifications she and Rose had made during their nighttime preparations. Loose rocks had been strategically positioned near the chamber's main entrance. Several of the supporting timbers showed signs of careful weakening, where Rose had used mining tools to compromise their structural integrity. And hidden in the shadows behind the altar, Rose herself waited with the implements they would need to execute their desperate plan. "Welcome to our chapel," Jeremiah said, his voice echoing dramatically in the chamber's depths. "Here, far from the corrupt influences of the surface world, we can make vows that will bind us together for all eternity." He led Margaret to the stone altar, which was covered with a cloth that couldn't quite conceal its sinister purpose. She noticed dark stains on the surface and fought down a wave of nausea as she realized what those stains represented. "Now then," Jeremiah continued, positioning himself opposite her with the altar between them, like some parody of a church wedding, "I want you to understand exactly what you're choosing here today. If you agree to become my wife in the truest sense, you will never leave this place. You will live here with me forever, devoted exclusively to our love and the paradise we create together. Do you accept these terms?" Margaret met his eyes steadily, drawing on every ounce of courage she possessed. "And if I refuse your generous offer?" Jeremiah's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing the predator that lurked beneath his civilized exterior. "Then you would be refusing the greatest gift any woman could possibly receive, and I'm afraid I couldn't allow you to return to the surface world with knowledge of our most sacred and private places." The threat was delivered with casual certainty, as if he were discussing the weather rather than murder. Margaret paused, as if weighing her options with genuine uncertainty. "Then I choose," she said slowly, letting the tension build as Jeremiah leaned forward in anticipation. "I choose to stay with you forever, Jeremiah, to be your devoted wife in this paradise you've created." The transformation in Jeremiah's face was immediate and complete. Joy, triumph, and what might have been genuine love shone in his eyes as he reached across the altar to take her hands in his. "My darling Rose, my beautiful Margaret, you've made me the happiest man who ever lived. We'll begin our true life together this very night, and nothing will ever separate us again." Yes," Margaret agreed softly, giving the signal Rose had been waiting for. "Nothing will ever separate us." The first support timber crashed down exactly as planned, sending a cascade of loose rocks tumbling across the chamber's main entrance with a sound like thunder in the confined space. Jeremiah spun around in shock and alarm, his attention diverted from Margaret for the crucial seconds they desperately needed. Rose emerged from her hiding place behind the altar with the speed and desperation of someone fighting for her life. In her hands was a mining pick, one of the heavy tools Jeremiah had provided for Margaret's work, and she brought it down in a sweeping arc aimed at the center of his back. But Jeremiah's reflexes were faster than they had anticipated. He threw himself sideways at the last possible moment, and the pick blade struck the stone altar instead of finding its intended target. Sparks flew as metal met rock with tremendous force, and the impact sent painful vibrations up Rose's arms that nearly made her lose her grip on the weapon. "You!" Jeremiah's voice was a roar of rage and betrayal that echoed off the chamber walls. "You're supposed to be dead. I mourned you for years." "Disappointed that I survived your loving care?" Rose gasped, struggling to lift the heavy pick for another strike, while her arms still trembled from the first impact. Jeremiah lunged forward with inhuman speed, his hands closing around Rose's throat before she could bring the weapon to bear again. 20 years I grieved for you. 20 years I searched for someone who could replace what I'd lost. And you were alive all this time, hiding from me like some animal. Margaret grabbed one of the loose rocks they'd positioned near the altar and brought it down on the back of Jeremiah's head with all the strength desperation could provide. The blow staggered him and drew blood, but didn't drop him. The man was far stronger than his civilized appearance suggested, and rage seemed to give him additional reserves of inhuman power. He released Rose and spun to face Margaret, his eyes wild with fury and something that looked like heartbreak. "And you lying, scheming witch! I offered you paradise itself, and this is how you repay my generosity. This is how you show gratitude for everything I was willing to give you." Margaret backed away as far as the confined space would allow, but the falling timbers had blocked several of the chamber's exits. They were trapped in the space they'd intended to be Jeremiah's prison, and their carefully laid plan was rapidly falling apart. "Your generosity?" Margaret spat, her own anger finally breaking through the fear. "You mean the 11 women you murdered, the bones you keep arranged like some sick trophy collection? I gave them everything a woman could possibly want." Jeremiah advanced on her, seemingly oblivious to the blood running down his scalp from where she'd struck him. "Love, comfort, security, purpose. They threw it all away because they couldn't appreciate perfection when it was offered to them." Rose had recovered the mining pick and was moving to flank him, but Margaret could see that years of malnutrition and underground living had taken their toll. The older woman's movements were slow and uncertain, and she was breathing heavily from the brief struggle. "You gave them death, Jeremiah," Rose said, her voice carrying years of suppressed rage and grief. "Nothing but death and terror and years of captivity disguised as love. I gave them immortality." He whirled to face his original victim, his hands clenched into fists that looked capable of crushing bone. "They live forever in my memory, preserved at the moment of their greatest beauty. What more could any woman ask for than to be cherished that completely?" The man was utterly, completely insane. Margaret could see that now with perfect clarity. In his twisted mind, murder was preservation, captivity was devotion, and the terror in his victim's eyes was simply their failure to appreciate the gifts he offered. There would be no reasoning with him, no appealing to conscience or humanity that no longer existed. But insanity didn't make him less dangerous. If anything, his complete break from reality seemed to have given him the strength and speed of a wild animal fighting for survival. Jeremiah feinted toward Rose, then suddenly changed direction and charged at Margaret with the fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. She tried to dodge, but he caught her around the waist and slammed her against the chamber wall with enough force to drive the air from her lungs. Her head struck stone, and stars exploded across her vision as consciousness threatened to slip away. "You could have been my goddess," he whispered in her ear, his voice tender despite the violence of his actions. "We could have ruled this underground kingdom together for all eternity, creating a love that would have made poets weep with envy, but you chose betrayal instead of devotion." Margaret felt his hands closing around her throat and knew she had only seconds before darkness claimed her permanently. Through her fading vision, she saw Rose approaching with the pick raised high, but the older woman was moving too slowly, her strength sapped by years of deprivation. "Let her go, Jeremiah," Rose said quietly, her voice carrying a note of authority that seemed to cut through his rage. "Your real fight is with me. It always has been." He turned toward Rose, his grip on Margaret's throat loosening slightly as his attention shifted. "My fight? Rose, my darling, I have no fight with you. I forgive everything, your escape, your years of hiding, this pathetic attempt at rebellion. We can begin again, all three of us together in perfect harmony." "No," Rose said simply, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "We can't. Not after what you've done. Not after what you've become." She drove the pick forward with all her remaining strength, aiming for his chest. This time, her aim was true, and the metal point punched through expensive fabric and into the flesh beneath. Jeremiah staggered backward, looking down at the pick protruding from his body with an expression of confused surprise, as if he couldn't quite believe what had happened. Blood began to spread across his white shirt, dark as ink in the candlelight. "Rose," he said softly, his voice filled with hurt bewilderment rather than anger. "Why would you do this to me? I love you more than life itself." "I know you do," Rose replied, her words carrying infinite sadness. "That's exactly the problem, Jeremiah. That's why this could never end any other way." He sank to his knees beside the altar, his hands clutching at the pick handle as if he could somehow reverse what had been done. "But our eternal love, our paradise, everything I built for us. There was never any love here," Rose said, her voice breaking with emotion. "Only obsession, only madness dressed up to look like devotion." Jeremiah looked up at her with eyes that were rapidly losing focus, but his expression remained that of a man who genuinely couldn't understand why his beloved was rejecting the paradise he'd created for her. "I just wanted to keep you safe," he whispered, "keep you beautiful and perfect, forever." "I know," Rose said again, kneeling beside him as his life slowly bled away onto the stone floor. "I know you thought you were protecting me, but love isn't supposed to be a cage, Jeremiah. Love is supposed to set people free." He tried to speak again, but only blood emerged from his lips. His last word was "Rose," spoken with the same tone of devotion he might have used for a prayer to the Almighty. When it was finally over, both women stood in the candlelit chamber, surrounded by the debris of their desperate battle and the silence that follows violence. The quiet felt strange and almost oppressive, after so many years of living in constant fear. "Is it really over?" Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Rose knelt beside Jeremiah's body, checking carefully for any sign of remaining life. When she was satisfied that he was truly dead, she looked up at Margaret with eyes that held a peace they hadn't shown in decades. "It's over," she said, "for us and for all the women who might have been his victims in years to come." Listen, escaping from the mine proved easier than either woman had dared to hope during the long months of planning their desperate gambit. Rose's escape tunnel, completed during her 3 years of patient hiding, led to an abandoned shaft on the eastern slope of the mountain that opened onto a landscape of pine forests and rocky meadows. From there, it was a difficult but manageable climb through terrain that felt impossibly beautiful after their weeks underground. They emerged into a world that seemed almost too bright to bear after so long in darkness. The Colorado sunshine felt like a benediction on Margaret's face, and even Rose, pale as a ghost after years without natural light, seemed to draw strength and hope from the open sky above them. But their ordeal was far from over. They still faced the challenge of convincing the authorities to take action against a dead man's crimes, exposing an underground chamber of horrors that most people would find impossible to believe, and somehow finding justice for the women whose only crime had been resembling Rose Blackwood. "We could simply walk away from all of this," Rose said, as they made their way down the mountain toward the lights of Goldstone Gulch. "Jeremiah is dead. The immediate danger is over. No one need ever know what happened in those tunnels, and we could both start new lives somewhere far from Colorado." Margaret considered this option carefully. It would certainly be the safer course. Who would believe their incredible story? And even if people did believe them, what purpose would be served by exposing crimes committed by a man who was already beyond earthly justice? But then she thought of the 11 skulls in Jeremiah's bone chamber, of the women whose families had never learned what became of their daughters, wives, and sisters. She thought of future women who might encounter men like Jeremiah Blackwood, and who might benefit from understanding that such monsters could hide behind masks of wealth and respectability. "No," she said firmly. "The families of those women deserve to know what happened to their loved ones, and people need to understand what kind of man Jeremiah Blackwood really was, behind all his money and political influence." Rose was quiet for a long moment, her face showing the internal struggle of someone who had spent years hiding from the world. "You realize what this means. We'll have to testify, probably in court proceedings that could drag on for months. People will say we're insane, that we invented these stories to explain why we killed a respected member of the community. Let them say it. We have evidence, the chambers, the journals, the bones, the portraits, and we have each other as witnesses to corroborate the details." When they reached the town, their appearance caused an immediate sensation that rippled through the community like wildfire. Rose Blackwood, supposedly dead for 20 years, walking down Main Street in tattered rags, like some ghost returned from beyond the grave. Margaret O'Sullivan, missing for nearly a month, emerging from the wilderness with wild tales of underground chambers and systematic murder. The sheriff, a man named Henderson, whose political position depended heavily on Jeremiah's financial support, was initially inclined to dismiss their story as the ravings of women driven mad by isolation and hardship. But Margaret had anticipated this reaction and came prepared with a strategy for overcoming official skepticism. She led a party of men back to the mine entrance, through the secret passages she now knew by heart, to the chambers where Jeremiah had maintained his collection of victims. The evidence was so overwhelming that even Jeremiah's political allies couldn't ignore or explain it away. The portrait gallery, with its dozens of photographs showing women who all resembled Rose Blackwood. The bone chamber, with its carefully arranged remains and fragments of clothing. The journals documenting years of psychological torture and the gradual deterioration of women trapped in an underground prison. The elaborate living quarters designed to hold captives in luxury while they slowly lost their minds. The story exploded across the territory and beyond, like a stick of dynamite in a powder magazine. Newspaper headlines from Denver to San Francisco screamed variations of Gold Baron's secret horror, the underground charnel house, and 20 years of murder in the Colorado Territory. Reporters traveled from as far away as New York and Boston to interview the two women who had survived Jeremiah Blackwood's madness and lived to expose his crimes. Some of the coverage was sensationalized and inaccurate, focusing more on the gothic horror aspects of the story than on the human tragedy it represented. But other journalists approached the matter with appropriate seriousness, using Margaret and Rose's testimony to explore larger questions about the abuse of power, the vulnerability of women in frontier communities, and the way wealth and political influence could shield monsters from justice. For the families of Jeremiah's victims, the revelations brought a mixture of closure and renewed grief. Some had suspected foul play when their loved ones disappeared, but had been unable to get authorities to take their concerns seriously. Others had accepted official explanations about women running away to start new lives in distant cities, and now had to confront the reality that their daughters and wives had died in terror and isolation. Proper burial services were arranged for the recovered remains, and a memorial was erected in the Goldstone Gulch Cemetery, bearing the names of all the women who had been identified as Jeremiah's victims. The inscription read, "In memory of those who sought opportunity and found only tragedy, may their suffering serve as a warning to future generations." As for Margaret and Rose, they discovered that survival had created a bond between them that transcended their shared trauma. Rose, slowly recovering her physical health and mental equilibrium with proper nutrition and medical care, proved to have considerable skills in bookkeeping and business management that had atrophied during her years of captivity. Margaret brought her mining expertise and her hard-won knowledge of human nature, particularly the ability to recognize danger beneath a civilized facade. Together, they used the substantial reward money, collected from various sources impressed by their courage and outraged by Jeremiah's crimes, to purchase a mining supply business in Colorado Springs. Their venture focused not on extracting gold from the earth, but on providing honest equipment and expert advice to other mining operations throughout the territory. The new Redemption Mining Company, Rose suggested as they stood outside their newly purchased office and warehouse. A different kind of redemption than Jeremiah's twisted version, something honest and decent, built on helping people rather than exploiting them. Margaret smiled, feeling something like genuine happiness for the first time since Patrick's death. I like it. A company run by women who understand the real cost of mining dreams from the earth and who won't let anyone pay that price alone. The business prospered beyond their most optimistic projections. Their reputation for fair dealing, technical expertise, and genuine concern for their customers' welfare made them the preferred suppliers for mining operations throughout Colorado and beyond. They employed 15 people within 2 years, including several women who had found themselves in circumstances similar to Margaret's original desperation. Margaret also used her experience and hard-won wisdom to help other women recognize the warning signs of men like Jeremiah Blackwood. She spoke at women's gatherings throughout the territory, sharing her story and teaching others to trust their instincts when something felt wrong about a man's attention or offers of help. Predators rely on our desperation, she would tell these audiences. They wait until we're at our most vulnerable, then offer solutions that seem too good to be true, because they usually are. The most dangerous monsters are often the ones who seem most civilized, most generous, most concerned with our welfare. 5 years after emerging from Jeremiah Blackwood's underground hell, Margaret O'Sullivan, now Margaret Whitman, having remarried the previous year, stood on the porch of her substantial house in Colorado Springs, watching the sunset paint the Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and crimson. At 51, she had found a kind of peace and purpose she'd never thought possible during those dark days of widowhood and desperation. The new Redemption Mining Company had become one of the most successful businesses in the territory, known throughout Colorado for honest dealing and technical expertise. Their reputation had spread far enough that they were now consulting on mining operations in Wyoming, Utah, and even California. Margaret took particular pride in the fact that they employed more women in technical and supervisory roles than any other company in the mining industry. Rose, who had legally changed her name to Rose Whitman to distance herself from the Blackwood legacy, had remarried 2 years earlier to a gentleman named Thomas Wright, a former teacher who understood that his wife's past had left scars that might never completely heal. Their courtship had been conducted with extraordinary care and patience, built on mutual respect rather than passion, trust rather than physical attraction. Margaret had chosen a different path when it came to marriage. Her husband, David Whitman, was a widower with grown children who respected her independence and understood that her business would always be an equal partner in their relationship. He was a quiet, steady man who had survived his own tragedies and understood that some experiences change people in fundamental ways. She still wore a locket sometimes, not the one Jeremiah had given her, which had been buried along with Rose's original wedding dress and other artifacts from their underground ordeal, but a new one containing photographs of her children. Sean had come west to work for the company and was proving to have his mother's instinct for reading rock formations. Michael wrote regularly from his position with the Denver bank, and even Bridget, now married with children of her own in Boston, maintained regular correspondence that helped bridge the miles between them. The mine, where their nightmare had unfolded, was sealed permanently by territorial order, with explosives used to collapse the entrance and prevent anyone from accessing the chambers below. Sometimes, on nights when the wind blew from that direction, people in Goldstone Gulch claimed they could still hear sounds from the depths, Whispers, cries, the echo of footsteps in abandoned tunnels. But Margaret knew better than to give credence to such stories. The voices people imagined they heard were simply the mountain itself, speaking the ancient language of stone and earth and slowly flowing water. The real ghosts, the women who had died in those chambers, had been laid to rest 5 years ago, when their bones were given proper burials and their names were spoken aloud for the first time in decades. On quiet evenings like this one, Margaret sometimes allowed herself to think about what might have happened if she'd made different choices on that desperate day when Jeremiah first appeared at her door. If she'd refused his offer, found some other way to deal with her financial problems, perhaps sought help from her children despite her pride, those women might still be alive. Their families might never have suffered the anguish of not knowing what had become of their loved ones. But she'd learned not to torture herself with such speculation. The past couldn't be changed, and dwelling on alternative histories served no useful purpose. What mattered was the present, the life she'd built from the ashes of that underground hell, the women they'd helped through their business and advocacy work, the small but significant ways they'd made the world safer for others who might face similar dangers. Rose visited frequently, and the two women maintained a friendship that was deeper than most marriages. They rarely spoke directly about their shared ordeal. There was no need, since each understood perfectly what the other had endured. But they supported each other through the occasional nightmares, the moments of unexpected panic that could be triggered by enclosed spaces or the scent of certain flowers, the anniversary reactions that marked significant dates in their underground calendar. "Do you ever regret it?" Rose had asked during one of these visits as they sat in Margaret's garden watching the late afternoon light fade behind the mountains. "Exposing everything, putting ourselves through the public scrutiny and legal proceedings?" Margaret had considered the question carefully before answering. "No, I think we owed it to the women who didn't survive, and to the ones who might have come after us if we'd kept silent. Besides, I've learned that secrets have a way of poisoning the people who keep them. Better to let the truth into the light, even when it's ugly." Rose nodded slowly. "Then God help us both." As darkness settled over the Colorado landscape, Margaret went inside to tend to the evening's correspondence and review the company's books. There was always work to be done, always new challenges to face and problems to solve. But now she faced them with the knowledge that she had descended into the deepest darkness imaginable and emerged into the light stronger than she'd ever been before. She was a woman who had survived 30 days in Jeremiah Blackwood's mine, who had discovered his darkest secrets and lived to expose them to the world. She had looked into the heart of true evil and refused to be destroyed by what she found there. And that knowledge, that unshakable confidence in her own strength and resilience, was a treasure more valuable than all the gold that had ever been extracted from the Colorado mountains. 10 years after her emergence from the depths of the Redemption Mine, Margaret Whitman stood before a gathering of women in Denver's finest hotel, delivering a speech that had become famous throughout the American West. The audience included wives of politicians, successful businesswomen, teachers, and frontier wives who had traveled hundreds of miles to hear the woman who had become known as the survivor of Goldston Gulch. "Ladies," Margaret began, her voice carrying easily through the crowded ballroom, "I stand before you today not as someone who seeks your pity or admiration, but as living proof that no matter how dark our circumstances become, we possess within ourselves the strength to overcome any evil that threatens us." She had aged gracefully in the decades since her ordeal, her auburn hair now streaked with silver, and her face bearing the kind of lines that spoke of wisdom earned through hardship. But her green eyes remained as sharp and determined as they had been on that first day when Jeremiah Blackwood appeared at her door. "Many of you know my story, how desperation led me to accept employment from a man whose charming facade concealed the heart of a monster. How I spent 30 days in his underground prison, watching his madness unfold and planning the desperate gamble that ultimately saved not only my life, but the lives of countless women who might have become his victims in years to come. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Margaret's story had been told and retold countless times in newspapers and magazines, but hearing it from her own lips carried a power that no second-hand account could match. But what I want to share with you today is not the details of that ordeal, but what I learned about the nature of evil and the responsibility we all share to protect each other from predators who hide among us. Margaret went on to describe the warning signs she had learned to recognize: the excessive generosity that came with strings attached, the isolation tactics that separated victims from their support networks, the way dangerous men used their victims' desperation against them. She spoke about the importance of trusting instincts, even when doing so meant offending someone who seemed to hold power over their circumstances. Evil rarely announces itself with fanfare, she explained. It comes dressed as opportunity, as rescue, as love itself. It speaks in cultured tones and offers solutions to our most pressing problems. It preys on our vulnerabilities and our natural desire to trust in the goodness of others. In the audience, Rose Wright listened with quiet pride as her friend shared the hard-won wisdom that had cost them both so much to acquire. Rose had chosen a quieter life, focusing on her marriage and her work with the company, but she supported Margaret's speaking career and advocacy work with fierce loyalty. The new Redemption Mining Company had become more than a business. It was a symbol of what women could accomplish when they refused to accept the limitations others tried to impose on them. They now operated throughout the Western Territories, employing more than 50 people and maintaining a reputation for integrity that made their name synonymous with honest dealing. But perhaps more importantly, their story had inspired other women to speak out about their own experiences with dangerous men. The Blackwood Revelations, as the newspapers had dubbed the exposure of Jeremiah's crimes, had opened a conversation about the vulnerability of women in frontier communities and the need for better legal protections against predators who used wealth and influence to escape justice. The greatest victory we can achieve over the evil that threatened us, Margaret concluded her speech, is to ensure that no other woman faces such danger alone and unprepared. We must look out for each other, share our knowledge, and never allow politeness or social convention to prevent us from warning our sisters about the wolves that walk among us in sheep's clothing. The standing ovation that followed lasted for several minutes, but Margaret knew that applause was not the measure of her success. The real victory lay in the conversations that would take place after the audience dispersed, the warnings that would be shared, the women who would trust their instincts instead of ignoring them out of desperation or social pressure. After the event, as Margaret and Rose traveled home to Colorado Springs by train, they sat in comfortable silence, watching the familiar landscape roll past their window. The mountains that had once seemed like a prison now felt like home, a place where they had found purpose and peace after surviving the unthinkable. "Do you think we've made a difference?" Rose asked quietly, voicing the question that both women carried but rarely discussed openly. Margaret considered this carefully, as she did all important questions. "I think every woman who heard our story and learned to recognize the signs of danger represents a small victory. Every predator who thinks twice about approaching a potential victim because he knows women are watching for his kind of evil. Every family that doesn't have to wonder what happened to their daughter because she was prepared to protect herself." She paused, watching a golden eagle soar above the pine-covered slopes. Jeremiah Blackwood believed he was creating a legacy of perfect love, preserving beauty for eternity in his underground museum. Instead, he created something he never intended, a warning that will protect women for generations to come. Sometimes the greatest victories are the ones our enemies never see coming. As their train carried them home through the heart of the Colorado Rockies, Margaret reflected on the strange twists of fate that had led her from desperate widowhood to a life of purpose and influence she could never have imagined. The woman who had descended into Jeremiah Blackwood's mine had been broken by circumstances beyond her control. The woman who emerged had been forged by fire into something stronger than steel, tempered by suffering into a weapon against the kind of evil that preyed on the innocent. She was living proof that survival was not enough, that those who escape the darkness have an obligation to light the way for others, to ensure that their own suffering serves a purpose beyond mere endurance. Margaret Whitman had stayed 30 days in a madman's mine and discovered something more precious than gold: the unbreakable strength of the human spirit and the power of one woman's courage to change the world. In the end, that was Jeremiah Blackwood's true legacy. Not the collection of victims he had intended to preserve forever, but the survivor who had turned his chamber of horrors into a beacon of hope for women everywhere. Margaret smiled as she watched the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold, knowing that somewhere in the growing darkness, other women were learning to trust their instincts, to recognize danger, and to protect themselves and each other from the monsters that walk among us. She had stayed 30 days in his mine and emerged not as his victim, but as his conqueror. And that victory would echo through the generations of women who would never have to face such evil alone.